This. The Occult.
Beatles.
Hello, I'm Matt Sergio, the proprietor of the sites Conspiromedia and the Occult Beatles. Back in 2012, I recorded a chat with veteran symbologist Robert Richard Hieronimus Ph.D, or otherwise referred to as Dr. Bob. In that chat, we focused in on the occult esoteric aspects that he could see in the 1968 Beatles animated movie Yellow Submarine. Dr. Bob's not only a researcher but also a writer. Indeed, in 2012 we talked about his book published in 2002, Inside the Yellow Submarine. That's an in-depth look at the actual making of the movie, featuring exclusive contributions with the makers of the film. Amongst other things, he's also the host of a long-running radio show, and his wife Sahara runs the Ruscombe Mansion Community Health Centre in their hometown of Baltimore in Maryland in the US. It's a centre that's devoted to holistic healing, including treatments in acupuncture, homeopathy, massage, herbal and flower remedies, Reiki, yoga, and more. If you haven't heard and viewed that chat I did with Dr. Bob back in 2012, then I'm thinking that it might be a good idea for you to go and do that before venturing into this, the second part of my chat with him, or to be more precise, my reunion with him, recorded in January of 2023, in which we talk about It's All in the Mind Inside the Yellow Submarine Volume 2, which was released in 2021, and which not only goes into yet more detail about the making of the film from the makers of it themselves, but also into the perceived occult esoteric aspects of the movie, something that wasn't really covered in Volume 1. In my chat with Dr. Bob in 2012, we spoke about some of those occult esoteric aspects that are in the movie, such as the images of the Yellow Submarine sitting on top of a pyramid in Pepperland. A Mayan pyramid is how it's described in Volume 2 of Inside of the Yellow Submarine, which is actually authored by not only Dr. Bob, but his longtime collaborator Laura E. Courtner, who's also to be heard chatting with me in the reunion chat with Dr. Bob that's just coming up in a few minutes. In my chat with them, themes pertaining to ancient Egypt in relation to the Yellow Submarine movie are focused in on. Dr. Bob has written about the ancient Egyptian deity Khepra, which has been depicted as possessing the body of a human and the head of an insect, the beetle. And as Dr. Bob has written, Khepra is a symbol of the setting and rising sun, and that's also been depicted travelling on board a phantom boat or spirit boat, or as Dr. Bob has described, a sunboat. There's parallels there with the Beatles' Yellow Submarine that travels across the sky, Dr. Bob suggests. During my chat with Dr. Bob and Laura, the concept of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is also discussed, how it relates to the narrative running through the Yellow Submarine movie. Campbell, a writer and philosopher who passed away in the 1980s, described the hero's journey as a journey that has been told over the ages in mythological form, but that is very much derived from real experiences. To quote Campbell, "A hero properly is someone who has given his life to something bigger than himself, other than himself. There are two types of deed. One is the physical deed, the hero who has performed a war act or a physical act of heroism, saving a life, that's a hero act, giving themselves, sacrificing themselves to another. And the other kind is the spiritual hero who has learned or found a mode of experiencing a supernormal range of human spiritual life and then coming back and communicating it. The hero's journey signifies death and rebirth, or in other words, the shedding of one form to another form, transformation, and it's a heroic act that comes about intentionally or unintentionally. For example, so Campbell said, there's the simple initiation ritual where a child has to give up his childhood and become an adult, has to die, you might say, to his infantile personality and psyche and come back as a self-responsible adult. That's a fundamental experience that everyone has to undergo. We're in our childhood for at least 14 years, and then to get out of that posture of dependency into one of psychological self-responsibility, that requires a death and a resurrection, and that is the basic motif of the hero journey, leaving one condition, finding the source of life to bring you forth into a richer or more mature or other condition. So as you'll hear Laura say later, transformation, a heroic act such as we see, Dr. Bob and Laura suggest, in the mythological tale told in the Yellow Submarine movie. There's a transformation at the beginning of the movie of the underwater multicoloured paradise Pepperland into a black and grey barren wasteland following the invasion of the music-hating Blue Meanies, whose chief leader, the Chief Blue Meanie, is so immersed in negativity that he can't even abide to hear the word yes, let alone the sound of music, and this prompts the hero's journey after Pepperland's young Fred is called on by the mayor to get on board the Yellow Submarine to look for help, which he does, stopping at Liverpool and welcoming John, Paul, George and Ringo on board to travel to Pepperland to rescue it, this underwater paradise, and meeting and experiencing along the way surreal, often scary adventures, such as when they go through the Sea of Monsters and the Sea of Nothing, where they meet and befriend a short, fluffy nowhere man, little Jeremy Hillary Boob, who accompanies them on their rescue mission. On arriving in Pepperland, John, Paul, George and Ringo meet their alter egos, Sergeant Pepper's band, and then, with Fred and the Boob, they all bring about an end to the Blue Meanies' occupation of Pepperland, and in the process entrap the Chief Blue Meanie's pet glove, a huge glove with a life of its own, a bullying, terrorising glove. They entrap that glove in a net made up entirely of the words love. Transformation of Pepperland from a wasteland back to a paradise through love, music and positivity. Positivity such as in the word yes. This transformation brings about the end of the Blue Meanies' rule, and the Chief Blue Meanie, well, he isn't mean no more. He turns into the Bluebird of happiness. Laura, during my chat with her, goes through the stages that accentuate Campbell's hero's journey and how she and Dr. Bob see it play out in the Yellow Submarine story. It begins in what Campbell dubbed the ordinary world. Then there's the call to adventure, and the journey moves on until it reaches the journey with the gift, which in John, Paul, George and Ringo's case, in the movie, is where they come back from their adventures in the Yellow Submarine and Pepperland with an engine from the submarine and a hole that Ringo lifted from his time in the Sea of Holes. As Campbell said, the hero act is departure, fulfillment, return. This, you might say, describes the Yellow Submarine story, because young Fred left Pepperland for help, found it and returned with it, and eventual success as the result. As mentioned in my chat with Dr. Bob in 2012, he takes the very strong view that the esoteric occult messages that he sees throughout the Yellow Submarine movie were not placed there by the Beatles, not consciously anyway. Indeed, the band's involvement in the making of the film, according to Dr. Bob and the crew behind the making of it, was minimal, to say the least. Dr. Bob says the Beatles were busy making their own film at the time, the ill-fated and self-produced and directed Magical Mystery Tour. The band, however, did contribute some new songs to the Yellow Submarine film and appeared right at the end of the film in person, in non-cartoon form, if you like, to play us one of those songs, All Together Now, which came complete with its title being displayed across the screen in multi-language form. So yeah, Dr. Bob doesn't believe the Beatles were consciously adding occult clues into the film, although back when he first saw the movie in 1968 he thought the contrary, and went so far as to write a letter to Paul McCartney in 1974, but didn't get a reply. And nevertheless, Dr. Bob has forged close personal relationships with the makers of the movie, including the Czech-German illustrator and designer Heinz Edelman, and with Beatles music producer George Martin, who Dr. Bob interviewed a number of times for his radio show between 1995 and George's passing in 2016. And he also knew Derek Taylor, the Beatles' trusted press officer, who first joined the band's inner circle in 1963 and went on to take care of their press and PR for their company Apple in the late 1960s. Dr. Bob's interviewed him too. And Dr. Bob's certainly no stranger to the 60s music scene, having rubbed shoulders with Jimi Hendrix, to name but one. This is something Dr. Bob and I talked about in our previous chat back in 2012, but Jimmy also gets a mention during my chat with Dr. Bob and Laura in 2023, a chat I recorded with them, as I said earlier, in January of 2023. And what of Laura, Dr. Bob's trusted co-author? I'd never spoken to Laura before, not before we hooked up in January 23, so I wanted to know more about her and her relationship to the Yellow Submarine journey.
Okay, sure. I have been pulled along on the Yellow Submarine journey, that's for sure, because of my association with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. I've been working with him and his wife, Zohara Hieronimus, who is also a PhD and an accomplished broadcaster, author, artist in her own right. I've been working with them at their healthcare center, the Ruskin Mansion, for close to 30 years, and started helping them with their radio program when they needed some help. And then put my English degree to work and started helping them writing their books and the various different subject matters that I had to become well versed in, one of them being the Yellow Submarine. As you may know from Bob's bio, he's a symbologist. He's one of the few people actually trained in the interpreting of various symbols, with his specialty being American symbols. So his PhD is on the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, which people know from the back of the $1 bill, and which has been misinterpreted wildly through conspiracy theory and popular movies to mean all kinds of things. But what his research has found is interpreting it from the founding fathers' point of view. What did they think it meant, since they were the ones who selected it and designed it and put it on the, well, they weren't the ones who put it on the dollar bill, that came much later, but still, they're the ones who designed it, and what did it mean to them? So that's what his whole dissertation was about. And because of his interest in symbols, when he first watched the movie, I was just a little baby at the time. He saw all this meaning. He thought it was a deliberately meaningful film full of coincidences and symbolism, which over the course of many, many, many years, it took us a long time to find out that that wasn't true. It was, none of it's intentional. You can say a great argument for being, there's a lot of unintentional meaning in Yellow Submarine. And I think that there's a great valid school of thought for that. All art gets interpreted beyond what the creator intended. So just along the course of helping him write that first volume, and then after that first volume came out in 2002, that's the one you interviewed him on before, we started hearing from all kinds of people that we had missed in the interview process. And at first we were convinced that they were just going to repeat everything we already knew. You know, we'd written a 400+ page book on the subject. How much more could there be to say? But we were surprised, and they told us a lot of new things, particularly from the crew people's standpoint, from the young people working on the film. We found in the first volume, we were interviewing most of the key players, the producer, the writers, the actual designers. And in the second volume, we interviewed a lot of the people doing the grunt work, you know, the tracing, the painting, and the key animating from, they were following the direction of those giving them the story, and the story was sketchy at best. So their experience is quite different. They had a lot more fun, the younger people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what comes through in volume 2.
Laura, are you a fan of the Beatles like Dr. Bob is?
Oh, yes, I think be considered a second generation fan, but I grew up absolutely loving them, learning about them from the Blue Album and the Red Album, you know, the best of collections.
Me too.
But also inheriting some of my older sister's albums. And I even still have one that has her handwriting written all over on the back, you know, I love Paul, and her girlfriend's I love Ringo, which is a wonderful keepsake at this point. But yes, I remember I was in high school when John Lennon was shot. I have one of those moments frozen in time when I heard it on the news. It affected me deeply, as so I really appreciated their later work, and especially Lennon and Harrison, I think, on a spiritual side. So yeah, the more I learned about them as an adult, the more I grew to really appreciate what musical geniuses they are in terms of putting music together and harmonizing, and the love poetry that they put out. It's exceptional. It's up above and beyond other people of the time. A lot of good rock and roll musicians out there, but theirs was a notch above, and I respected that from an early age.
And so here we are with volume 2, and in the book, in the earlier chapters, there's 2 or 3 chapters there. So basically, most of the book is, as you've already said, it's basically going back, a revisit to some of the crew members who were behind the making of the film, crew members you missed out in when you were putting together volume 1. But in the earlier parts of the book, in the earlier chapters, they're focused mainly on the esoteric, or the occult, if you like, what's described in the book as speculative interpretation of the Yellow Submarine, the movie, or as it's also described, speculative ideas of metaphorical comparison. Some of what's described in this area of volume 2 of the book, Bob, you and I talked about in the previous chat we had back in 2012. And a lot of what we talked about then with regards to the esoteric and occult aspects of the Yellow Submarine movie were also to be found back then online at your website, 21stcenturyradio.com. There's a quite a lengthy piece there where you go into some of those occult aspects that you guys see in the film. And I featured some excerpts from that website, the where you go into this on my own website, Conspiromedia, back then. But in volume 2, you really go into it so much more, so much more. You know, as I say, in there's about 2 or 3 chapters worth of esoteric occult analysis going on there. So yeah, you're taking much more of an extensive look into that aspect of the movie and the song itself, Yellow Submarine, in volume 2. Right. So what sparked that? Why didn't you do that in volume 1? Was there a reason for that? And why have you really got into it in volume 2?
Well, the volume 1, I started obviously on my own, and I was struggling with it because I could see that there were a lot of things that I needed to know myself before I could make the decisions that I had to make in regards to what things to put in and what things to take out. The Beatles are an extraordinary group. I sometimes don't even think that they're human. I know this is going to sound corny to a lot of people, but sometimes as we evolve on this planet, we grow in consciousness. And one of the great things about the Beatles is that they always have been in the area of kindness and consciousness and looking out for others. This is so much different than so many other rock and rollers that I know. I mean, well, there are some other exceptions, such as Hendrix. Hendrix was extraordinary, and still is, obviously. But Hendrix, he knew something was going on through also symbols. He and I got together when I was going to be doing a cover, a record album cover for him, or for this particular group. And obviously it did not get done because we got involved in the history of the United States. I never expected that when I first met Hendrix, that he would ever pay attention to books. He just didn't seem to be that way, but he did. As a matter of fact, I had with me when I first met with him a book on the history, of all symbols, dictionary of symbols, and I used to carry these books around with me all the time, 3-4 books at a time on this. And when he saw me and saw my drawings in my journal, he said to me, "What's going on here? Something is going on here that we don't know about, and no one's telling us." And that's when he and I both decided that we were both going to stick it out and find out what this was all about. So he's very much different than many of the other rock and rollers that I worked with from that standpoint, in that he was ready to be educated, and he knew there were things that he needed to know about our country and its symbols. And that's why he loved, obviously he loved the flag a great deal, or else he wouldn't have been singing about it. But also at the same time, he was growing to the point where what was his purpose in knowing this material? Because it is a totally different view of how you look at the United States of America through symbols and through other images and consciousness, which he seemed to grasp immediately and others did not.
So it was his sort of to that ethic that we were writing in volume 2. And to answer your question specifically, the reason that we didn't in volume 1 is because the publisher cut it out.
He didn't want anything in it.
We had a regular publisher for volume 1, which was Krause Publications. They're a good publishing company.
Yeah.
They specialize in rock and roll history books. And that was Bob's intention, was to include all of his historical his symbolical interpretation, which is unique to himself, in his book. And they just decided it was too over the heads of most readers, as I think what they were afraid it would be.
They didn't think anybody would be interested.
Or not interesting enough, right?
Yeah,
So
right,
they
yeah.
decided keep it all factual and research based and none of the speculation stuff. That's why you found it on our website, because that was originally written for the volume 1 and it ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. So that was another reason that we decided to do volume 2. It's a lot of work to write a book, and you can see there's almost 20 years between 1 and 2. And that's because we were busy doing other things. But when we finally decided, well, we thought we would put it out for the 2018 50th anniversary of the film. That would have been a really good idea, but we couldn't get our act together, mostly because Bob was busy painting a new Woodstock bus, and that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But it slowed us down, and we ended up getting the book out in 2021, through the pandemic and everything. But one of the main reasons we did it, besides getting these new information from new interviews, was to include this symbolic interpretation, which is the nut of Bob's contribution, I think, to the research of the film. But we did find a whole lot of other people had been writing to us over the years, and we did some research. So we included other people's thought processes on the film that were even more deep than ours, which is pretty deep to begin with. But there's an examination of quantum physics, and someone else takes on an examination of time and the nature of time travel, and they relate that to what they saw in the film. There's one fellow named Jake Pollard, who, if you haven't interviewed yet, you probably should. I think it would be really interesting to you.
Yeah.
He's written a book called With a Love Like That, The Gospel of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And he's gone through every song in chronological order and analyzes them from a metaphysical standpoint. So it's very interesting when you do that, and you can see the thread woven through the songs as the Beatles themselves mature, from writing about holding hands with a girl to, full-blown philosophical tenets that they were getting out of the book of, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and other types of research into consciousness that were, they quote right out of these old ancient tomes of wisdom in some of their songs later on. So I highly recommend his work. If you could check him out, he's got some stuff online, but he hasn't published yet. He hasn't, again, trouble finding a publisher. I think with anything Beatles related, you have to be very careful of their lawyers. I think publishers are rightly scared off. If it's not an official Apple product, then they can be a little scary.
I understand that there were over a dozen other people wanting to write a book on the Yellow Submarine, and the Beatles just weren't having it. They didn't want to have it done.
Yeah, they wanted to control the story.
And that's unfortunate. I think that was one of the things that I found I didn't like.
Disappointing,
Yeah,
yes,
it's
but at least
disappointing.
you worked with them enough. You worked your charm enough, as I would like to see, that they gave you a blanket sort of, okay, you can go ahead and write your book. We won't get in your way. I think that's the way they put it.
Yeah.
We won't stand in your way. We're not going to help you. We're not going to open up our archives or send you pictures or anything.
Yeah.
So it limited us in what we could use. But fortunately, with volume 2, we did find several people who had cameras in the studio and took a lot of pictures of people at work, and we didn't have those in the first volume. So that's a really nice addition. And volume 2 is fully illustrated. We went self-published this time.
Yeah.
And we could afford it to make the color. The color photographs, again, are very expensive to reproduce. So that's why you don't see a lot of that being published. The paper is very expensive.
And you were so good at picking all those colors out and all the other things to work with.
It worked out well.
There are multiple things that you have to do, obviously, in writing a book, because it was really a struggle to get this book published. No doubt about it. The first one, it didn't look like it was going to happen, and I'm so happy that it did. But we had to make an enormous amount of noise. I'm certain the Beatles didn't necessarily like that, but we were determined to find out the meaning of this particular movie, and I don't know if they felt that there was any meaning there. And I think that since they are so well educated. They are well educated in all kinds of esoteric stuff, mainly because of the friends that they had and they grew up with in London, and the places that people that published their books, etc. So it was really quite an extraordinary experience from the perspective of growing up, and because I had no idea that the second book would have been the best. I think it's my opinion, it's the better of the two books, mainly because you can see all of the colors. There are over 200 color illustrations, and that was exactly. I was so happy that Laura was able to put all of that together. She's very brilliant. No, she is, and this is, I don't want to embarrass her. It's just that she is. She's extremely smart, almost as smart as my wife, and that's pretty smart. And both of them together, when they work together, because they do work together, are extraordinary, because it's a good example of higher consciousness helping lower consciousness and evolving from that and growing with that.
Take a bow, Laura.
Well, yeah,
Well,
I'm not going to follow up with that.
You would never want to work for me.
Let's get
No,
back to the subject
no,
of-
wait a
yeah.
minute. I want to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell the truth. I'm extremely hardworking, and I do work extremely long periods. And I expect that when people work with me, that they put up and do it and not talk about it. Right? You know what I mean by that?
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of people that want to talk about interesting things, but the thing is when you want to get to the real story of the Beatles from the standpoint of higher consciousness, they have led hundreds of thousands of other people in that area and educated them and are educated by them. I just that's the kind of thing that I'd love to see about all of the musicians that I ever used to work with. They're good readers, the same as Hendrix and some of the others, from the standpoint of trying to get to the real reason why we do the things we do and accomplish the things we do.
In the book, in volume 2, there's a description of you from back in the day. It's esoteric groupie. So would this be connected to the 60s, the late 60s scene, and what you were explaining there earlier about Hendrix and all the other musicians, the well-known musicians and singers you met and worked with?
Yeah, I'm going to take advantage of this one and talk about Dr. Bob, since he just talked about me for the last minute.
Oh.
So yeah, Dr. Bob had a colorful history there at the end of the 60s. He was working with Elektra Records. They were trying to get him to design album covers because he'd done one for an obscure group called John Fred and his Playboy Band. They had a #1 hit, and they were a one-hit wonder called Judy in Disguise with Glasses.
Yeah.
And he did their album cover, and they were very impressed with him as an artist because he would travel around with some local groups here in Baltimore and up and down the East Coast and talk about meditation and reincarnation and astral travel and all these different things that they were just fascinated by, and teaching them meditation. There's this one group here in Baltimore that ended up with the name Light, and they named themselves that after the light meditation that he taught them backstage. And then they painted their bus and they called that the Light Bus, and that's the one that went up to Woodstock and became famous and is now called the Woodstock Bus. So Bob was traveling around in these painted, some would say psychedelically painted, but they're not. They're incredibly intricate symbolic messages. They're not just flowers and peace symbols, in other words. And painting these gigantic murals at Johns Hopkins University is one of his most famous known ones, called The Apocalypse, and another one called The Lord's Prayer. And, full of eyes and triangles and UFOs and yellow submarines sometimes, and other esoteric symbols. So that's what he was known for. And that attracted the notice of John Fred and his Playboy Band, and then the folks at Elektra Records. And they said, you've got to meet Jimi Hendrix, and you've got to meet some of our other artists and get you talking to each other. So that's what he did. He was just describing that scene up at the Scene nightclub in New York, where they used to go after they performed, and where he met Hendrix and went on to meet some other folks, the Doors. He was principal in introducing them to Baltimore. And Janis Joplin, I know you had an encounter with her at one point, and he became very good friends with the Love and Spoonful, a wonderful group that was based out of Baltimore for a part of the time, and did some album covers for them and for other members of Light. So that's why the journalist who was writing about him at that time was calling him an esoteric groupie, since he was being drawn into their realm as well as they were being drawn into his realm because of that esoteric connection, because he was known as a meditation teacher, as among other things.
I'm so glad
You're welcome.
But she knows me inside and out. I was born to do like everybody on this planet. We are all born for a purpose. We're all born for a reason. One needs to find out what that purpose is. It didn't take me long to find out. I found out before I was like 25, somewhere around there. And so that puts you ahead of everything else from the standpoint of knowing what your purpose in life is. Then you don't waste as much time in getting involved with things that aren't good for you or are not going to work.
Okay, to the Beatles. Okay, now get ready. Hold tight. I hope you won't find this too tedious. If you do, then slam the brakes on. I'm going to go into one a little bit, okay? And at the end of it, you can say what you think, and you can slap me down if you think I went in a wrong direction somewhere. So, okay, guys, this is it, okay? Right. Now, with regards to the Yellow Submarine, the movie, okay, now, if I'm not wrong, the overarching theme, your interpretation of the Yellow Submarine movie is rebirth, or in other words, regeneration, such as in the ancient Egyptian veneration of the insect, the beetle, more to the point, the scarab beetle. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, Bob, the previous time we spoke back in 2012, you suggested that the band, the Beatles, chose the name the Beatles, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps it was an unconscious reference to the insect, the beetle, as in this venerated insect in ancient Egypt. Now, according to what we might term the official story of the Beatles, or in other words, as the version that's been put forward by one or more members of the band over the years, the name Beatles, there's actually quite a few versions, but to try and keep it brief, one of the versions is, of course, back in the late 50s, early 60s. Members of the band then were fans of Buddy Holly and his band the Crickets. So one of the stories that's been put forward, one of the versions that's been put forward by one or more members of the Beatles, has been that they basically took they were inspired by the name the Crickets and thought to themselves, okay, well, they had this admiration for Buddy Holly, his music. So they took they looked at the name the Crickets and thought to themselves, okay, let's give ourselves an insect name but give it a double meaning. So they came up with Beatles. So it's Beatles as in insect, and of course the way it's spelt, B-E-A-T, refers to beat, as in beat music and all the rest of it. Now, another version of how the name the Beatles came along, and this is leaning towards John Lennon's famous witticisms, his talent for the surreal. He said in a magazine interview sometime in the early 60s that, of course, as you guys know, he said that a man on a flaming pie came to him in a vision, and he said to him, "You shall be Beatles with an A." Now, what people might not, what the majority of people who have a passing interest in the Beatles, not a particular who aren't really sort of dedicated fans, but have a passing interest in the Beatles' history, might not realize that actually the Beatles, for a time in the very early 60s, sometime around then, pre-Fame days, of course, were actually called the Silver Beatles, and that was with the insect name. also, sometime up until about early to mid 1963, if you look at some photographs, you can actually find there's a drum skin, Ringo's drum skin. If you look at the logo, and this would have been up until about, middle of 63, when they changed the logo, they were using the name The Beatles with a logo, but it had an insect inserted into the writing. So it looked like it had had antennae in the logo itself. And that, as I say, that was up until about 1963 or so. And according to a 2-volume biography that came out a few years back now, I think it was by Kenneth Womack. It was a 2-volume biography on George Martin, the Beatles record producer.
Yeah.
Now, there's a reference in that. I don't know how true it is. There's a reference in that their debut album, which came out in 63, which was in the UK, which went on to get the title "Please Please Me." That's the album, of course, with the now iconic cover of the Beatles peering over a balcony. Now, apparently, according to this book, I don't know how true this is or where this information comes from, but apparently, before they came up with "Please Please Me" and this record, this photograph that they had for that album, they were actually thinking of calling the album Across the Beatle Tracks. And this was apparently an idea that was devised by McCartney back then. And he came up, and apparently one of the ideas, and this was actually going to happen, but it was blocked due to logistical reasons at the sort of 11th hour. Apparently what they were going to do, they were going to go to London Zoo, to the insect section, and I think they were going to actually take pictures of the Beatles standing outside the insect enclosure of London Zoo. So of course the reference there being Beatles as in insects, and the Beatles, and the word play and all the rest of it.
I didn't know any of this. I just looked up that drum skin. I had no idea. Very interesting.
What do you say now?
I just looked up that drum skin as he was talking, with the Beatles logo with the insects coming out of it.
So
thank you for sharing all that. I didn't know any of that.
Well,
I find this most fascinating. I will keep going. Great. You're not slamming the brakes on yet. Good.
No.
Okay. So, Bob, if you remember in the first, it was a long time back in 2012 when we first met up and talked about all of this. I mentioned in passing, and I can remember when I mentioned this to you at the time, you were like, "Oh man, this is like wow." If you recall, before the Beatles were the Beatles, I think this was in their days when they were still students, or when they were still young guys. It was very much pre-Fame days. They used to hang around a club in Liverpool. It was called the Casbah. It was owned by Mona Best, who was the mother of Pete Best, who then went on to become the Beatles drummer for a time before Ringo came in and took over in 62 when they got their contract with EMI and Parlophone. Now, there's a story that Pete Best has said many times, and you can find quotes of this. It's not hard to find. According to Pete, these young guys, these provincial lads from Liverpool, pre-Fame days, long before the days they went to London and were mixing with the intellectuals and the esoteric minded, they helped to paint the Casbah Club. I think this was part of just to help out, really. They were just kids, basically. And according to Pete, a lot of the designs that they weren't just painting, they weren't painting, they were actually designing. They were coming up with logos and symbols, basically, to decorate the club. And Pete describes the Paul and John and Stuart Sutcliffe, who was in the band at the time, coming up with all these ideas and George Harrison, of course, coming up with ideas for Aztec symbols that they painted on the ceiling of the club. There was a spider's web as well, and rainbows and all kinds of stuff. But basically, what Pete was referring to is the fact that they were painting esoteric kind of symbols. So we're talking here pre-Fame days, these young guys who were barely, not even 20 yet, coming up with these symbols, and you can find pictures of the Casbah Club with these symbols painted on the ceiling. So I'm getting to my point. I'm getting to my point. So okay, with regards to the scarab beetle, as according to ancient Egyptian beliefs, it was regarded as a symbol of rebirth, resurrection. And to borrow from what you said, Bob, about this in our last chat in 2012, it was regarded, I'm trying to remember what you said quite literally. It was regarded as a symbol of rebirth because the scarab beetle, after laying its eggs, rolls the egg into a dung ball, into a ball shape. Then one day out pops a newborn beetle from it. And to the Egyptians, this looked like some form of magic, like it had created itself. Okay. So to add to that, there's the Egyptian god Khepra, who you guys have referenced in your works. Now, he's the beetle-headed deity, body of a human, the head of a scarab beetle. And this is a creation god too, also regarded as a sun symbol. So again, rebirth, because the sun sets but rises again the next day. Okay, so I'm getting to my point. Yellow Submarine itself, as you guys point out in volume 2, yellow symbolizes the sun. And in the movie Yellow Submarine, we have a yellow submarine that travels across the sky. So this is, you could say, sun symbolism. Now, how does this all tie in? What I'm saying? Okay. So we have the sun symbolism here, as I just pointed out. The sun is indicative of rebirth. The Beatles, you could say, or the scarab beetle is a rebirth symbol. So you have the Yellow Submarine movie, which, as a result, what I'm getting to is about rebirth. So it's an allegory of death and rebirth. Watching the movie, it's not a physical death as such, but okay, of personal inner growth, as with regards to the hero's journey, as put forward by the writer Joseph Campbell. So yeah, that's the point I was trying to. That's what I'm getting at, basically. That is my point. All of that stuff that I just mentioned, beginning when I began it by saying that the overarching theme of the movie is about rebirth on an esoteric level. So yeah, in conclusion, basically what I'd like to get your take on, and to slap me down where I might have got it wrong, basically, as you state yourselves in the book in volume 2, and as you have done in previous years, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is tied into the idea of that is tied into the narrative, the esoteric occult narrative of Yellow Submarine, the movie. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, can you elaborate on that? Can you add to that? Can you?
Thank you and good night.
Yeah.
Wow.
You just summarized our whole book for us. Thank you very much. And again, I had never heard of that painting of the ceilings, and I'm Googling it while you're talking. Fascinating. Wow. Bob, you go first.
Well, I'm open to anything dealing with the elevation of consciousness. And if the symbol of the beetle being rebirth means reincarnation. Now, what do you think of reincarnation?
What do I think of it? What, as a personal viewpoint, or?
Yes. What do you think of reincarnation?
I'm open to the idea. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you are, because that's what this is about. Is our going from one birth to the next birth, and growing and elevating our awareness over a series of lifings. How do you call it? Lifings like that, huh? Lifetimes. And that's what I saw a long time ago in regards to opening up your consciousness to the sun. You're obviously interested in the sun, right?
Yeah.
Well, the sun and I always looked at this beetle and the sun as one. That's not a fact, but that's how I saw it. Would you? Because I'd like to talk about it, what I like to think, right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so when we get to this opening up of their inside and realizing that, why are you here? Why is everyone on this planet? Why are so many going to die in the near future? I think this is maybe a little bit too heavy for me to go through, talk about. I don't want to depress anyone on this, but what I see is something very difficult coming. And I just wish everyone would find out who they are and why they're here. And if they do this, we will stand a much better chance of surviving what is to come, because the kind of force in the weather that's coming is almost, and you've seen more recently what's going on, it's going to get much worse. We need people that are looking for, working towards the preservation of this planet and how to work with other people in doing so.
If I may jump in here, just on the line of who we are and why we're here, and that would be one of our goals in spreading the word of the Yellow Submarine. Basically, it's a movie that is a vehicle to doing that. It makes you feel good while you're watching it. It's got this wonderful beat and dance and danceable music, excuse me, and that beautiful color and the message that you summed up very well. If somebody had asked me what I thought was the theme of the Yellow Submarine before you started, I would have said rebirth and generation, yes, but I would have also added transformation. There's this element of transformation that happens in this movie that's key to, I think, its success over 50 years. Here we are 50 years later talking about a cartoon, for crying out loud. But it is, they don't kill their enemies. They transform them, and they transform them through the power of love. It's this wonderful magic that the Beatles in this character of the movie come up with. It's a blend of music and magic and love, because the meanies attack at the beginning of the movie while Sergeant Pepper's band is playing music. So it's not just music. It's clearly an elevated kind of music. And the song that actually does it is All You Need Is Love. They graphically display that with the words capturing in the nets, the capturing the bad guys in the nets of the words. So the transformation is what comes from the hero's journey that you mentioned. And I think that is easily traced in the plot line, such as it is, of the Yellow Submarine, because one of the writers was a professor of classics at Yale, and he was well steeped into the hero's journeys of Greek mythology and so forth. So all the great classics that we know today as classics, like Star Wars and Wizard of Oz and J.R.R. Tolkien's works, they all follow the similar pattern that you can also trace in the Yellow Submarine. If you start the structure of Joseph Campbell's, when he looks at a particular myth, is it starts out in an ordinary world, that would be in Pepperland. Then there's a call to an adventure, that's the attack on Pepperland. There's the refusal of the call when young Fred objects to the Lord Mayor's trying to assign him to captain the submarine. Then there's the meeting of the mentor, that would be when Fred meets Ringo and the other Beatles, they would be his mentors. They cross the threshold, that's when the submarine goes into Liverpool and dives into the Thames. They face a series of tests, and then they find their allies and enemies. That would be through the seas of illusion. That's a big part of the movie, when the submarine is traveling through all these various seas of illusion. They approach the inmost cave. In that case, it would be the nowhere land, where they meet the boob. It's this nothingness. It's a very strange, spooky place of nothing. And then you can go into the whole study of the nothing is real, and how that's such a wonderful concept for going within and learning how to meditate. But the next step would be they face a huge ordeal. That's the battle with the Blue Meanies. There's an atonement. That's when they invite the Blue Meanies to join them. That's the key part of the movie there. And in the end, they return with the gifts. So you see the real life Beatles returning with the hole, the mirror, and the little love. And then you have John Lennon's warning at the end that there's newer and bluer meanies in this very theater, and that causes the cyclical mythological return. So that makes the story return and go over and over and over again. But that's just one of the elements that we studied in analyzing the submarine from different perspectives. And it all comes down to learning who you are, like the characters in this movie do. They transform as well. But the biggest transformation is when the little boob, that little character that they were going to leave behind, but Ringo wakes up enough to bring him along. He shows compassion. And that little boob at the very end of the movie, he saves the whole movie by transforming the worst evil blue meanie into a bluebird of happiness, just by using that powerful word of yes, and this little spell that he reads to him about the power of yes and love, and he realizes, he sort of wakes up out of his shell of being blue and mean into accepting a world of color and light. And that's what the best part for me of the movie is going out. You all go out together. How do you go out? You go out singing, and there's that wonderful little sort of childish song, All Together Now. And then they flash it up in all these different languages of the world. So it's something that we've noticed wherever we go. If I'm wearing a Yellow Submarine pair of earrings or something, everybody, no matter what language they speak, they know the Yellow Submarine. We all live in a Yellow Submarine. I think just about everybody in the world knows that song. And it's another way of saying we all are one people on one planet. And that's what Dr. Bob's been saying forever.
That's the key.
Why
one
can't we
people,
just get along?
One planet.
One planet. We all are in this together, all together now.
And there are many ways to move towards it. And I'm listening to you. I'm talking to Laura right now, as this is a soul that I've worked with for 20 some years. And I must tell you, I am thrilled to have her analyze that from the perspective that is the basic perspective of the reason why of these things and bringing people together. Loving people is very important in keeping this planet together.
And the other one you say all the time, Bob, is prayer, meditation, service.
Yes.
You don't get that so much through Yellow Submarine in an obvious way.
Yeah.
But it does speak to the overall consciousness raising that it brings about.
And service is the key. It is the most important thing. Helping others, looking out for others. I know how corny that may sound to a lot of people, but it's the truth. We need more love on this planet. The Beatles have supplied it. They showed us it. They showed us the symbols in it, whether they believed it or not. This is extraordinary from the standpoint of having young men at this time actually pointing to the direction that we all need to go in, which is coming together now.
It's a myth, isn't it? That's what this Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the Yellow Submarine, this interpretation you have here that you've presented is a classic myth, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah. Do you think people know what a myth is anymore? You do.
No.
You do state in your book that you think the myth, the power of the myth, the art of the myth is something that's died, that doesn't get used anymore.
Well, it is being used more because we've been waking it up. That's the reason why we have a radio show, 21st Century Radio. Over how old is it now? 50 years? I don't know.
Since 88.
And we have been putting the same material out, finding people that believe in this kind of thing and have them introduce it to other people as well. And
there's also a subconscious understanding, even if you're not aware of understanding something that has deeper meaning, it can resonate with you on a subconscious level. That's why Bob talks about his art cars being packed full of symbolism. Nobody can really read that as it's passing by you on the highway, but perhaps on a subconscious level, you're going to be triggered by something that you see, and maybe see it again when the next time you see it, you'll look it up. But I think that it's myths and symbols both are language systems that you either you understand or you don't. And you can still, with symbols in particular, since they're pictorial, you can still get a lot out of them without understanding what you're, the history behind them. But I think there's this new Netflix series with Graham Hancock. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but called Ancient Apocalypse, and it's based on his older books, of course, but it's bringing home again and again how myth was a code in a way for the history of what the ancients were trying to leave behind as important information. So we may not have understood them that way until thousands of years later, but that may have been what they meant them to be all along, rather than just a story of some folks going out into the woods and getting lost. We all know those stories, but the deeper meanings of them, I don't know.
this really taps into what we're talking about here: myth, the power of myth, subconscious, unconscious readings of symbols, and Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey. This ties into the Swiss psychologist, the ideas of the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung, of course. With that in mind, having rewatched the film once again, yet again, before talking to you guys, it's amazing how much you miss out on. It doesn't matter how much you watch a film over the decades. You can watch it again after a few decades, after having watched it many, 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 many times, and you still pick up on ingredients, if you like, you know. So I watched it again a few days ago before we're hooked up here right now to record this. And with regards to Jung and his ideas, and I was just looking at, for example, the Sea of Monsters, where you have the submarine traveling through the Sea of Monsters. Perhaps that could be signified on an emotional level, with one's own monsters. I mean, I think you guys might have picked up on this too. It's a journey of the submarine is making, but it's actually the characters within the story, the narrative, are going through their own personal monsters. Yeah. And
that's right. You got it. You got it.
Yeah. The blue. You mentioned the blue meanie at the end, who turns into the blue bird of paradise. Again, would that be right? I mean, you could look at that as the shadow self, the Jungian shadow self, where you have this evil blue meanie, this jackboot stomping blue meanie, who suddenly has this other side to it. It's basically, that's its shadow self coming out. I don't know if I'm just throwing this stuff out to you guys.
Well, it's all interconnected. But the most important thing is the search. It's the method by which you discover this information over, and it's repeatedly discovered. That's the reason why I know meditation works and prayer works, and I know that helping other people works, because I do it and I see it, and I hope others, and I try to encourage others to do it as well.
Yeah.
And the Sea of Monsters is an interesting part of the film in that it doesn't have any Beatles music. It's like 6+ minutes long, and it's all out of Heinz Edelman's unconscious. He loved drawing monsters. He was the designer for the film. And his contract was something like 4 weeks, and he ended up staying for 11 months, the whole project, because they kept giving him scripts that were not acceptable. And they said, here, design that. And he would start designing it and get nowhere because the script fell apart, or they were just silly, and they were trying to go into the direction of the old cartoon series on television, and everybody in the artist camp wanted it to be more sophisticated. So he was getting frustrated as all get out, and he kept quitting, and they kept having to go find him. And then one time they gave him a script that was full of mermaids and Davy Jones' locker, and he just absolutely refused. He said, I've never drawn a mermaid, and I am never going to draw a mermaid. I just will not go in that direction. So instead he sat down in utter frustration and started churning out monsters, because that's what he likes to do. And that's how the Sea of Monsters was born. It's all his creation of these characters that are conglomerations of everyday things and animals or people. It's an interesting, he did that all through his career. We would get New Year's and holiday cards from him full of all these little creatures, and it's always so clever. You know, you had to study them for a little while to understand what he was lampooning. And sometimes his humor was quite dark, especially when it was pointed towards Disney. That's why the Blue Minis are, many of them are wearing Mouseketeer helmets.
I see. Okay.
That's a jab at Disney's more rigid approach to artwork than his was. But the Sea of Monsters was another place where their compassion starts to show up. So I like the idea that it's the shadow self and the Jungian interpretation that you threw in there. That's the first time when Paul actually is the first one. They accidentally eject Ringo into the Sea of Monsters, and he's in a great deal of peril. He's being chased around by some Indian type monsters shooting arrows at him. And so the other three are like, oh, well, I guess we'll be a trio now. And they just casually go on. We'll just leave him behind until Paul says, well, maybe we should rescue him. So that was a sort of shedding for him of his old hard self of this is the way we perform. We're always making fun of each other, into a more compassionate, let's save Ringo to begin with, and then Ringo later on saves the Nowhere Man, in turn, who saves the movie.
Right.
Yeah, you
And he's
mentioned the previous cartoon, the previous to the Yellow Submarine. I think between 64 and 66, there was this series of cartoon shorts that they I don't think they were ever screened in the UK, not at the time, not in the 1960s. But I might be wrong. I might be completely wrong.
They have since. You're right.
But they have since.
Yeah,
but
I heard the Beatles themselves were adamant about they never were allowed to be shown in the UK.
Yeah, that's what I understand as well. They weren't happy with it. They thought it was too sort of, I don't know, trivial, and the voices, they didn't. It was
a kind of a put down.
Yeah.
Kind of put down.
Yeah, they were 5-minute little shorts, weren't they?
Well, they were longer than that. It was a Saturday morning cartoon, but they animated the songs, so each of those were short, and then they strung them together with a semblance of a plot, much like the Monkees. Have you seen the Monkees show?
Yeah.
It's similar like that. It was driven by the music and a little bit of silly plot in the middle. And you're right, the voices were Mid-Atlantic. They weren't Liverpool. And the artwork was rushed because it was a weekly churn. They had to turn something out very quickly. So it looks like the Flintstones. Somebody said that it looks like the Flintstones because it's the same style of animation, sort of jerky and blocky.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting that from that style and the same kind of like the same team, if you like, this, or the same brains behind that, or who were working on that, then went on to make something that's so completely different with the Yellow Submarine. It is
talking transformation and rebirth. They certainly did it to themselves. Yeah. And it was the essential team: the director George Dunning and some of the key animators, George Stokes and Jack Stokes, and John Coates. Charlie Jenkins was also involved in the series. But they brought in a whole lot of other people. The international crew, the movie film crew was much bigger. And they brought in, they said everybody who was working on animation who was within a 200-mile radius, they just pulled them in. Yeah, they were determined not to do the same thing. That's what Al Brodax, the producer, wanted them to do. And that's why he gave them such a short deadline and a small budget, because he thought they could whip it out just like they'd done the TV show. But they were tired of doing it, and they knew that a feature film would be it would have much more longevity in history books and so forth. So they wanted to do it right. And that's why they found Heinz Edelman to design it, who had never done animation before, but he had this edgy, unusual look in the posters that he was doing in magazine graphics. So they brought him in. He didn't speak much English. Charlie Jenkins found him. He was a very experimental animator. Charlie is responsible for all the experimental parts of the film. He did that end sequence to George Harrison's song All Too Much. That was pretty much mostly Charlie's work by himself. He had the secretive special effects bench. Everybody was in awe of what the magic that he could do with a piece of sticky tape and cellophane. But yeah, they were very determined. George Dunning in particular was an artist, and he was hard pressed. He and Al Brodax were like chalk and cheese. They did not get along. And Brodax was always pushing to do it fast, and Dunning was slowing everybody down because he was ethereal. So Heinz Edelman also said that he inserted what he estimated being a 10% more color and more design than he would normally have been put in, or that even that the brain could absorb. And that was based on his reading. He had never tried any psychedelic drugs, didn't want to. He was just a blue collar person who drank Jack Daniels and stuck to that. But he'd read a lot, and he'd read Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley and the others who were experimenting with mescaline and LSD at the time. So he was trying to emulate the psychedelic experience in some of that. And I think that's why the viewer comes away with this sense that this is very trippy. Those people must have been tripping when they did this, where it's just impossible. You couldn't be on a drug experience in the exacting art that animation demands of you. It's just not something you could do at the same time. But they did intentionally try to give that in effect, the flashing colors. And as you said yourself, you've watched it probably countless times, but you watched it and saw new things. You'll find that with any beloved movie, when you watch it again and again and again, oh, you don't notice that in the background, but there's so much stuffed into Submarine. There are so many things. You have to pause it. You have to put it on pause to see, when they eject all those things out of the submarine in the Sea of Monsters. You can't read all that, see all those little funny jokes that they put in there, unless you pause it and put it on freeze frame and look at it carefully.
Now, that said, that's a good point to mention here, that in the book, in volume 2, you actually give a blow-by-blow kind of occult, esoteric analysis, narration, if you like, of the film. So you actually start in written form in the book. In volume 2, you start from the start of the film and describe the film as it's moving along. You describe certain scenes that are happening in the film, and the story, and you put in your occult, esoteric perspective into that, right to the end of until the film ends. So basically, in a way, it's like a written version of a DVD commentary. I was thinking it'll probably never happen, but it would be a really neat idea if there was, like you get these DVDs where you get the director's commentary and you can listen to the
Yeah.
direct. Well, wouldn't it be great if you two guys could do your own like esoteric commentary as the movie is moving along? That would be great.
That would be fun. Yeah, you're right. That'll never happen because of copyright.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you never know. I shouldn't say never. They may invite us to do that. But yeah, we're doing something kind of like that, but not exactly.
Okay.
We've called it the Yellow Submarine University, and we've launched that on our website, yellowsubmarinebook.com, and on YouTube. And we just did an episode that just launched yesterday, actually, analyzing the new release of the Yellow Submarine song. I'm sure you heard about that a couple months ago on the Revolver special edition.
Yeah, I was wondering whether I should ask you about that, because there are previously unheard of lyrics.
Unheard, not only just unheard, but never heard of before. Nobody
Yeah.
even had been talking about it. Everybody had assumed that the story on that, the writing of the Yellow Submarine song it was a Paul song. He dreamed it up one morning when he was half asleep. And I think even John corroborated that in
That's right, he did, yeah.
later historical. So either he forgot or he very kindly just gave it away, because what's revealed when they pulled that out of the archive was that John wrote the beginning part of that song, and it was quite different from what we know today as a jaunty children's song. It was quite melancholy. It was in a minor key, and the words are sad. So if he hadn't combined it to Paul's song about submarine, and I have something else to say about this, I just learned today. We probably never would have had the movie, right? Because if they'd never turned it into this happy yellow children's bright song, they wouldn't have been attracted to make an animated song about something that starts out with in the town where I come from, no one cared. No one cared. That's so sad. It resonates with what he was saying at the time he was writing that, as around the same time he wrote Nowhere Man. I'm all alone. I'm no one. I'm nothing. Clearly something he was struggling through psychologically. But what I learned today was from the friend I mentioned earlier, Jake Pollard. He saw that post that I'm referring to about John Lennon, and he said, here's something else that most people miss. John Lennon, in talking about his very first LSD experience, which we've all read about, he and George were given it they weren't aware of it at the time. So they spent the whole evening tripping without realizing it until they came home.
It was spiked, wasn't it? They were
right,
at a house, a dinner party, and it was a dentist, wasn't it? A friend of theirs.
Their dentist.
Put it in their coffees, without them knowing,
The end of the story is it's at the end of the night, they came back to somebody's house and they were all sleeping in the same place, and everybody fell asleep except for John. And he tells having this a hard time falling asleep and just feeling like he was in a submarine, and then he was 18 feet high. Anyway, he used the word submarine, and it was a very strange experience going in and out of reality. So Jake was pointing that out to me, that it's possible that John mentioned that story to Paul, which in turn seeded Paul's idea of waking up one morning about a song about a submarine. So it may even go deeper than John writing those first couple of lines and starting the melody off. He may have actually come up with the idea of a song about a submarine, which I think we are all believing still was Paul's idea, and may have been, it still may have been, but it may have been seeded by John's LSD experience, however many weeks before. It was all in the same time period.
So, this new version, not new, this is dating back to 66. This previously unheard demo version of Yellow Submarine, as sung by John, was on the Revolver Deluxe box set release in 2022. With regards to inspiration, Now, I know both of you are rather strong about the view that the Beatles had nothing to do with any of the narrative that we see in the film. So if one does perceive an esoteric, occult perspective to the movie, one must take into account you two would argue that none of the Beatles had anything to do with that. I remember, Bob, when we spoke back in 2012, you said you remember watching the film back in the day, back when it first came out, and seeing all this symbolism coming at you and thinking to yourself, my God, the Beatles are geniuses. They're like, what kind of minds can come up with all this symbology that's being like thrust upon me in this movie theater? It's just so initially you had this idea that it was the Beatles that have come up with these ideas, and you actually wrote to Paul in 1974. This is featured in volume 2. You've got a piece from the letter. You wrote to Paul in 1974 about symbolism and quote unquote cosmic influences. And if I may, I'd just like to read the excerpt that you wrote to him in this letter. You said to him, "There is a science as to how ideas and patterns of consciousness filter their way down to the minds of man. I believe that you are susceptible to having opened the door to these archetypes and are unconsciously able to collect the information at certain times under certain conditions. You could probably care less about this process, but it is a talent of great importance." And then you go on to state that you got no reply to that. You also said to me, Bob, in 2012 that you tried to contact all or most of the Beatles many times, but they were not interested with regards to possible clues that they might have put in themselves about symbology. Now, as I say, you two guys have been very clear that the Beatles had nothing to do with the symbolic interpretations that one might see in the film. I'd like to read a couple of quotes from John Lennon, and I'd like to get your take on these and why he said these, why he's reported to have said these things about the film itself. In 1972, John is reported to have said in 1972 about the film, he said, "The producer, Al Brodax, got half of Yellow Submarine out of my mouth. The idea for the Hoover, the machine that sucks people up, all those were my ideas. They used to come to the studio and chat. 'Hi, John, old bean, got any ideas for the film?' And I would just spout out all this stuff. And then they went off and did it." And he reportedly said in 1980, and I'll get your take on this after I've read this one out. I've got it here printed in front of me. He's reported to have said in 1980, again, about the Yellow Submarine, "The Yellow Submarine people, who were gross animals, apart from the guy who drew the painting, the actual Yellow Submarine, they got all the ideas for the glove in the sky and the thing that sucks people up. That was my idea. They said, 'Have you got any monsters, John?' And I said, 'Yeah, there's Horace, the vacuum cleaner in the swimming pool,' which was a thing you could buy, and it went round the pool sucking up the things, And I said, that could be a monster that sucks. And all things like that. They just took them and never credited." So I'd like to get your take on those two quotes there from John Lennon from 72 and 1980, reportedly. Yeah.
Well, you want to go to this first?
Yeah, I'll take him on.
Yeah.
Because we knew of those quotes and actually read them to Heinz Edelman. And I have my own interpretation of what he was talking about there. And I'm glad that you read them in their completeness. And it's interesting how they changed just a little bit over the 8 years between the two quotes. And he's focusing on that Hoover, the vacuum cleaner monster. That seems to be very important to him. So I would say the only people that ever met with the Beatles on a regular basis was Al Brodax and his minions. That would be Abe Goodman and maybe some of the other people from King Features. And those are definitely the people he's talking about when he says they were gross animals, because they were. I mean, no offense to Brodax and his family, but he was the quintessential American producer with the brash attitude and the cigars. They were the whole bit. and they were clearly on a different track. They wanted that movie to be done quickly, cheaply. They didn't care about the art. They didn't really care about the Beatles. They saw them as a money-making venture. And that was very clear. So I can understand why he would have that disdain for them. And they did have to work with them to a degree at the beginning of the cartoon series. Now, again, I think he's mixing up the cartoon series and the movie in his memory, and I can bless him for doing that. And once the movie started, they had almost no contact because the Beatles
That's
were
right.
out of the country for
Mhm.
most of the time. They were in India. They were dealing with the death of Brian Epstein, and then they were making their own movie. So that at one point they were seeing the Magical Mystery Tour as a sort of a competition. They were coming out at the same time, being produced at the same time, around the same corner. They were in the same neighborhood doing the same things. So I think they were keeping the film at arm's length. They gave it just what they had to, contractually obligated. They gave them those few minutes of film, a couple minutes of promotional time at different dates. And it's quite possible that at some point Al Brodex went to him and said, "Do you have any ideas?" And it's quite possible John did say that. I don't deny that he may have said that. Same thing happens with the Peter Max story. Peter Max, famous American designer who was probably the most famous, most successful graphic designer out there, likes to go around saying that he designed the Yellow Submarine movie when he didn't. He didn't have one piece of input on that film. But Al Brodex may have come to him at some point and asked him to do the film, and he may have turned it down. That's possible, but he did not, and he may have gotten a call from John Lennon. They may have talked about it. That's possible, but he did not, as did John, have no influence over Heinz Edelman designing those monsters. It's a coincidence if he suggested a vacuum monster that it made it to Edelman's ears, possible, but not necessarily necessary. Edelman was clearly very inventive with making up monsters on his own, and he denied it. So I just go with his word on Heinz Edelman saying, no, he never heard from John Lennon to make up a monster like that. So I go with his version on that.
Yes, you're right. You're right,
Yeah.
Laura.
Thank you.
There's some, obviously some, as you, well, there are so many things that were going on. It's just the wonder that things worked out as well as they did. So I think that John was, I hate to put it this way. I can't believe that Heinz Edelman did not pay any attention to him. He did.
Oh, well, he did. He likes to talk about the story
Right.
when they shared lunch together and they talked
Yep.
about the doors of perception, and they had a very heady conversation.
Yes, he did.
I'm sure that if he had suggested anything to him, he probably would have been happy to share that with us. But I'm not saying he didn't suggest it to somebody related to the film. He may have, but whether or not that ended up in Heinz Edelman's ear, we don't know. There's a similar controversy about the actual design of the submarine itself.
Oh yeah.
That is it's interesting, after not wanting to have anything to do with the film, that they're arguing about who influenced what. That's actually it's a nice sign that he he holds it in esteem enough to want to take credit for it. But there's a lower designer on the film named of John Kramer, who's, after he died, his estate put out a sketch that he had made of the submarine, that they purported was the original, that he was the one who actually came up with the design of the submarine. And we spent an appendix on that. There are lots of other different versions of the Yellow Submarine. Of course, the song came out in '66, the film in '68. So a lot of people were illustrating it. They used it in the peace movement. A couple of different peace organizations built floats of submarines, and they would sing the song as they were protesting the military's involvement in the Vietnam War. And they had buttons. One of the famous New York organizations created a Yellow Submarine spouting flowers and a peace symbol out the conning tower, and you can actually see George Harrison wearing one of those buttons at the Yellow Submarine premiere, and the other folks, the other Beatles, are wearing it in I think it's a Sgt. Pepper premiere party. They're all wearing that Yellow Submarine button. That was long before the Yellow Submarine was designed by Heinz Edelman. So the fact that this fellow John Kramer, or at least his family, came out and said that he designed it was a bit of a, again, wait, how could that possibly be? So we sussed that one out too, and we've decided that Kramer was definitely working for Edelman, and he was on the film beforehand. And if it was his picture, it was definitely influenced by Edelman to begin with. So again, Edelman had it in his contract that he was credited with all
All
design.
designs, yeah.
So he is,
You,
regardless of who may have thought of it first.
you said earlier in passing that there was someone who was on the team helping to put together the film Yellow Submarine, who was tuned into ideas of an esoteric nature. When this was when we were talking with regards to Joseph Campbell and Jung and
The person I referred to was Eric Siegel.
yeah,
He was well trained in the classics,
Yes,
right,
he's-
okay,
so he would have known all about the hero's journey.
yeah. So yeah, could you expand on that a little bit about Eric's ideas?
I don't know any more about that. Do you?
Eric was profiled in volume 1, so we're quite well removed from his story, but he was somebody that Al Brodax found. As I mentioned, there was a big scramble for script, and they went through lots of different script writers, mostly because Brodax was trying to make it something simple and quick, and he was going through his cartoon contacts. And Siegel was one he finally found that the Beatles could relate to, somebody who was about their age and had the right kind of sense of humor. So he came in at the end of August, and much of his dialogue was used in the Nowhere Man segment and a lot of the travel sequences. But then the other dialogue was mostly written by Roger McGough, a Liverpudlian poet that they found and ended up not getting any credit.
Yes, he did. We made sure he did get
Well,
credit.
he didn't get any credit on screen.
Oh, okay, all right.
I'm not sure that they corrected that in the DVD version.
Well, we got a message from him that they did.
I hope they did,
All right.
because it's well known now that he contributed a lot of the very
Yeah.
funny dialogue.
Yeah.
But a lot of the dialogue was contributed by the actors themselves, the voice actors and the animators, because they couldn't wait. They have to do the dialogue first, and that's a lot of what Eric Siegel did, was a lot of the dialogue so that they could start animating. They were they had the crew assembled, but they had nothing to animate because they didn't have the script, and they couldn't record the script because they kept rejecting the scripts.
Of course, Roger McGough was in a band called The Scaffold, which one of the members was, of course, Mike McGear, otherwise known as Mike McCartney, who was Paul McCartney's brother, of course. I'll just throw that in. Okay, so to round things up, I just want to, I mean, what I would say is I have really not, if anyone wants to look at the book, if they're wondering what else there is with regards to the esoteric occult aspects, your perspective of the film, well, with regards to that, we've only just touched very lightly on it. There are so many more aspects connected to it. If anyone wants to go take a look at the book, then I would do that, because there are so many more strands within the theme that haven't even been mentioned, and if they have been mentioned, they've been mentioned like in a second, and then they're gone. So I'd like to just round this up now, just mention in brief some of the aspects of the song. Laura, you touched on it very briefly there, where the song itself, Yellow Submarine, was picked up by the peace movement as early as 1966, the anti-Vietnam movement. Can you expand a little bit on that, and also how the Christian movement was inspired by it too?
Yeah.
And there were Yellow Submarine churches.
I know that
Wow.
was something covered for volume 2. I didn't know about that either, but it was an offshoot directly of the peace movement using it, because it was pretty much the same people, the organized religion, the liberal church movement in Berkeley, California, who were some of the leaders in the peace movement anyway. And that's where the submarine church movement, then later to be called the Yellow Submarine Church movement, was started. And it lasted a couple of years into the mid-70s, where they were, let's say, alternative churches. A lot of them had focuses for helping runaways, or people with drug addictions, or even protesting the war protesters. So they acted as shelters as well as churches. They felt it was really important to return to Jesus's original mission of serving and helping the poor and helping the others. They tried to attract young people by doing alternative services. So they would serve communion with like pretzels and beer instead of wine and bread. They would do active protesting when the official church would do their official church meetings, once a year kind of thing. They would go and protest at those meetings and unfurl banners of big yellow submarines, trying to get them to return again to the original service of mission of service. And they lasted, as I say, until the funding sort of dried up. I don't think that the official church liked being poked and prodded and pointed out, so their funding sort of dried up. And who knows what causes things to end when they're really on a good purpose and a mission. Their mission is good, but with the peace movement, there's all kinds of reasons. People get jobs, and there's infiltration by the man, and people will start deteriorating the movement from within.
So why did they pick up on submarine in the peace movement? Is it because is it because of the lyric, "We all live in a yellow submarine"? They saw that as kind of like a community kind of message. Is
So.
that, yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have an interview
Yep.
in there from somebody in the after they sang it spontaneously at a peace rally in Berkeley, saying we've adopted this. They created a little flyer saying no confidence in the Berkeley administration, and they used a submarine on there, one of the first people who depicted a submarine, saying, yeah, this music speaks to all of us. We're all in this together. And the nautical theme, of course, worked for the anti-Navy establishment. When the Navy would march by, they would sing that one in particular.
And blue meanies as well. They would shout blue meanies at the cops.
Well, yeah, the blue meanies at cops. Cops started to be called blue meanies when they would come in and break up the protests. That was a common nickname. I think that's even in the dictionary somewhere. Blue meanies is a common nickname for the bad cops.
Yeah. What I would say, if anyone listening to this really wants to get down deep into the esoteric occult perspectives, really, we've just like tapped on it slightly. There's so much more. I mean, with regards to the Bible, if you want to tie that into the Christian church and the Yellow Submarine churches, there's a mention in volume 2 of the movie with regards to Noah's Ark on top of Mount Ararat, because of course in the movie we see the Yellow Submarine on top of a Mayan pyramid. So that kind of, you're suggesting in the book that this could be tied into the Noah's Ark, in the Great Flood, escaping the Great Flood, the Mount Ararat, on top of Mount Ararat. And of course then you go on to mention Atlantis and lots of stuff. So if anyone wants to go take a look at this book, what's the best thing for them to do? How do they do that?
Well, the best way is yellowsubmarinebook.com. That's our website, where you can also get bonus prizes when you buy from us, autographed copies, yellowsubmarinebook.com. But it is also available on Amazon, as well as through Ingram Publishing Company. So folks who are overseas from us in the United States, that might be the best way to do it. You can go into any bookstore and ask them to order it, and they will, because they can, through Ingram Publishing Company, or Amazon. Amazon is also a more less expensive way to order it when you're overseas. You just don't get the bonus prizes you get when you order from us directly.
And would you like to direct us to any websites that you guys have that we might want to go take a look at and listen to? There's the radio shows, of course, isn't there?
Yeah, well, the best thing is yellowsubmarinebook.com. That's simple. And it has all our social media there. We are active on Facebook, Instagram, and somewhat on Twitter. And it includes links to all our bios and whatnot. So you can learn and follow us from there.
Laura, Dr. Bob, thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. You've been so generous with your
Certainly
time.
have.
Great interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Matt Sergio, and you've been listening to me in conversation with Dr. Bob Hieronimus and Laura E. Courtner. Before I sign off, just a brief mention once again on the subject of rebirth. Inside the Yellow Submarine Volume 2, Dr. Bob and Laura point out that the Beatles were masters of rebirth and renewal because they started out in the 1950s as young teenagers plucking out simple skiffle tunes as the Quarrymen, and then eventually transformed into a hard-rocking, leather-wearing band in the clubs of Hamburg, Germany, and then tidied themselves up in suits in order to make it into the big time, becoming the lovable Mop Tops, and then transformed into the psychedelia-soaked Sgt. Pepper's Band, and then stripped themselves back to comparative basics in 1969 in readiness for their Let It Be Get Back phase. And Ringo, having been born in July means his sign is Cancer, a symbol of, rebirth. Now, I'd suggest that Ringo contributed perhaps to the ultimate rebirth in the Beatles, given that he was brought in to replace sacked drummer Pete Best shortly after the band had signed their record contract. As a result, what Ringo brought to the band was, as many commentators have since said, the final essential ingredient in them conquering the world. Anyway, maybe something there to think about. Thanks for listening and viewing. Until the next time.